Here are some telltale signs that you grew up with an overly critical parent. Number one, you have a tough time making changes with either your hair or your wardrobe, your fashion sense. Number two, you have a tough time saying no. Maybe also you struggle in your relationships in terms of feeling confident. You've noticed that your self-esteem isn't where maybe your peers' self-esteem is. Perhaps you struggle with giving presentations in school or at work. Public speaking might be a struggle for you. You might even have social anxiety. Now, all of this can trace back to having an overly critical parent, because when our parents are constantly criticizing us, it really creates this sense of anxiety that there is no right way to go about things. It makes it really hard to make decisions and stand tall and confident in accordance to them, because it feels like in one way, shape, or form, we're disappointing somebody, we're inadequate, or we're somehow possibly making the wrong choice. Now, what this equates to is a lack of psychological safety. Psychological safety is basically a feeling of security and certainty in the world. But if our parents are constantly our worst critic, and no matter what we do, they're displeased, then it's really, really hard to have that feeling of psychological safety. Now that we know what's been going on, let's talk about why this might have happened. Now, for ethnic minority parents, immigrant parents, conformity is safer. They feel like power is in numbers. Therefore, if they notice something different about their child, they're going to view that as unsafe. And they're going to want you to conform and get with the majority, get with the program ASAP. This is simply because of fear in their body. Why do they all have fear? Because a lot of them went through hardships. Now, this is a cultural variable that we're going to talk about, but essentially, let's say we're looking at the Punjabi population. Our language as a whole, which is a cultural variable, language, is rather rough. If you look at the dialogue in Punjabi language, it's not really sugarcoating things. It's very direct, it's abrasive, it's abrupt, and there's no tiptoeing around things. There's only hard edges, no softness to it. And so a lot of the times when they're communicating to us, if they had said it in English, potentially there was a way to say it gentle and nurturing, but because of what they're used to, their default is just to be direct and succinct to the point, then it's going to come across as hurtful and impactful to us. Number two, when people have been through hardships, it can harden them. Now, their reality and our grandparents' reality was one of a lot of struggle, a lot of stress, turmoil, danger, and threat. This means that they didn't have the luxury to soften their demeanor, their attitude, their approach, their communication. Now, let's talk about another cultural variable. The population is very, very dense in India. And when you're growing up in a place that is very overly stimulating, very loud, very eat or be eaten, it can kind of foster a little bit, again, a more of a rough around the edges personality, because they feel softness equals weakness. If you're not assertive, if you're not dominant, you're going to fall behind and you're going to be in trouble. A great way to visualize what I'm talking about here is just think about how traffic goes in India. Nobody's giving way, everybody's putting themselves first, and it is a very assertive, dominant type of attitude that helps them navigate their way through their world. So it does simply come down to the fact that our world is very different in terms of historical dangers or threats that we've experienced in our lifetime opposed to what they've experienced, as well as the language. There's a difference there. So their comfort levels in maybe gentle kind of communication isn't quite there because they haven't developed that. And then lastly, the actual physical environment is very different. They're used to being in big crowds, and in order to survive in big crowds, you have to have a more tough and dominant approach. Lastly, differences in parenting. Now, what do we see in the TV shows we watch growing up? We see gentle parenting, we see positive parenting practices. So of course, especially when we're maybe going to classmates with majority culture members, they're totally having a different experience from us. But in the East, we see different type of parenting, which more revolves around something called negative reinforcement. This is the idea that corrective action is more likely to occur if we take something away. So in the East, we see a lot of negative reinforcement. So let's give an example. Maybe child's not cleaning their room. Negative reinforcement looks like, hey, your room's messy, no PlayStation for a week. Positive reinforcement looks like, hey, remember that time you cleaned up your room before bed and then you had a really good sleep? So the idea is you're trying to create repeated behavior by reinforcing good feelings from within the child. Whereas negative reinforcement is a lot more about punishment, and it creates this idea of needing to appease your parent or an external party. And if you don't, then they're going to be disappointed and you're going to have something taken away from you. So a lot of the time when they're being critical, they think they're parenting you, and that's the way to go about parenthood. It's what they received from their parents and their parents from their parents, so on and so forth. But when we know better, we do better. So it's really important to kind of depersonalize this behavior to understand all the variables at play. And of course, it's always a valuable experience to go to counseling therapy and heal some of the wounds that might still be lingering due to their criticism. A lot of times, our adult inner voice is actually our parents' critical voice that they were using to kind of scold, chastise, and try to guide us in the way that they knew best. What are your thoughts? Feel free to disagree if you feel like some of these points are not valid, but if you have seen this to be relevant in your own family systems, I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time.